Welcome to the channel. It was the third day since I found out my wife was cheating on me with her coworker, Thomas. At first, I couldn't believe it. Leila had gone to Paris on business. Said she'd be too busy to talk or check in. Then, I stumbled on her correspondence while she was out. Emails, texts, all there, casual as anything. Messages filled with cheap romantic phrases and blatant flirts. "Missing the taste of you," Thomas had written. My jaw clenched at every line. This wasn't just an affair. It was a full-blown performance right under my nose. Most men would confront her, have it out, demand answers. Not me. That's not how I operate. I knew I'd only have one chance to make my move, and if I did it right, I'd make sure she never saw another dime of my money. I had friends in the legal world, friends who knew how to play the divorce game like a master violinist, and I planned to set them to work immediately. But first, I needed proof that couldn't be disputed. Enter Frank, a private detective friend of mine. Frank owed me a favor, and he was the kind of guy who wouldn't blink at digging up every bit of filth in my own house if it helped me. Sure enough, he uncovered that Leila and Thomas had even been meeting in our home while I was at work. I wasn't dealing with amateur cheaters here, they were pros. Now, while Leila thought I was meekly waiting at home, I was maneuvering everything out from under her. I'd taken over all our joint accounts, securing control without her knowledge. Over the past weeks, I'd slipped documents in front of her, hiding my intentions beneath everyday legal jargon she couldn't be bothered to read. Little did she know, her name was being erased from everything that mattered. Meanwhile, I arranged to sell the house. Legally, of course, as I now held full control. By the time Leila would step foot back in this country, the house would be gone. No happy homecoming for her. I planned every detail down to the last signature. But there was still Paris. I made a call to an old contact, a man they called El Diablo. He had a reputation for making people's lives a living nightmare. El Diablo didn't ask questions, didn't need explanations. All he needed was the address of their Paris hotel and a guarantee that payment was good, that I could easily provide. Then, with everything set, I waited. On the day Leila was due back from Paris, I was sipping coffee at a cafe downtown, watching the rain splatter against the glass. If my phone buzzed, it was Frank. He'd just gotten word that Leila and Thomas' romantic getaway hadn't exactly gone as planned. Apparently, they'd been in the hospital the night before. Something about a bar fight, multiple injuries, and Leila's arm in a cast. Good old El Diablo had done his job, and by the sound of it, he'd gone a little above and beyond. I headed back to our now empty house one last time, the place echoing like a hollow shell. All the furniture was gone, save for a few items that had no place in my new life. I took one last look at the wedding photo Leila had insisted on framing above the fireplace. Her radiant smile, my naive, trusting grin. The irony was almost laughable. So, I left the photo right there on the floor and walked out, locking the door behind me. A couple of hours later, I got the message that Leila had landed. It was showtime. My phone rang barely an hour later. "David," she barked, her voice jagged with frustration. "Why is our house empty?" "Your house?" I replied, feigning confusion. "Leila, I'm not sure you remember, but we signed it over to me. A couple of weeks ago, actually." I paused, letting the realization settle. "Oh, and it's sold now." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could imagine her standing there, injured, exhausted, wondering if she heard me right. "Sold," she finally shrieked. "David, what are you talking about?" "Yep," I continued, a bit too cheerfully. "I hope you had a great time in Paris. Oh, I filed for divorce last week, too. Frankly, I've been busy." The words came out casually, as if we were chatting about the weather. Her voice lowered, venomous now. "You can't just do this to me, David." "Oh, but I already did," I replied, shrugging even though she couldn't see me. "Turns out, it's pretty easy to do all sorts of things when your wife's too distracted by her business meetings to pay attention to what she's signing." After a stunned silence, her voice cracked. "You've ruined me, you know that?" "Ruined? Leila, you ruined yourself," I said, letting the bitterness creep into my tone. "And just so, you know, the evidence of your affair, it's already in court. You're not getting a dime." She launched into a hysterical rant, threats, insults, bargaining pleas, but I'd tune out by then. Instead, I let the phone fall silent as I walked toward my car, tossing her one last goodbye. "Oh, and one more thing," I said, unable to resist a parting shot. "Hope you're feeling safe these days." I ended the call and leaned back in my seat, finally feeling that weight lift from my chest. Leila could do what she liked, but her new life wasn't my concern anymore. As I drove away, I thought back to the Boy Scout emblem I'd tucked into her things. A small token of the loyalty she'd taken for granted. I might have lost my trust in her, but I'd gained something better, a fresh start. Somewhere, as Leela stood alone, facing the consequences of every decision she'd made, I hoped she felt the same. I thought that final call would be the end of it, that I'd finally have my peace. But nothing with Leela ever ended cleanly. A few days after that call, I got a message from Frank. He followed up, doing a bit of digging on his own. Turned out, Leela hadn't been content to just go quietly. She'd been spreading stories wild, unhinged stories about how I'd taken everything from her in some cruel, calculated plot. The drama was turning her into a spectacle, as though she thought rallying friends and family would somehow restore her image. Frank figured she was setting up for a last-ditch courtroom play, hoping to cast herself as some tragic victim. I almost laughed when he told me. Victim? This was a woman who turned her home into her personal love den with Thomas. The same woman who thought she could gaslight her way through life. But still, I had no intention of letting her control the narrative. No, I had one last move left in my pocket. On Frank's advice, I reached out to a couple of friends who knew Leela, old college buddies, mutual acquaintances from work events, and some of the ladies in her book club, people who'd been around just enough to catch glimpses of her little indiscretions. Or at the very least, to know she wasn't the devoted wife she claimed to be. A few gentle hints, a bit of background on how long I'd been quietly adjusting our accounts and selling assets to protect my interests. It was all they needed to start piecing things together. I knew the rumor mill would take care of the rest. The next week, I showed up at the courthouse to sign off on the final divorce paperwork. As I walked down the courthouse steps, the weight I'd been carrying for years felt lighter with every step. That's when I saw her Leela, standing at the curb, her arms still in a cast from her Paris escapade. She looked haggard, as though she'd been living in the same clothes for days. David, she called, rushing over, her voice raw and desperate. She tried to put on the charming, wounded look that had worked on me so many times before. David, we need to talk. I didn't think it would end like this. I took a deep breath, looked her dead in the eye, and let my voice come out smooth and calm. I don't think we have anything left to talk about. Leela, it's over. You made your choices. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging in as she scrambled to hold on to any last shred of control. David, please. We can work this out. I didn't mean for things to go this far. We've been through so much. Think of everything we've built. I shook her off, feeling a strange mix of pity and satisfaction. Built? Leela, everything we had, you destroyed. And now? I stepped back, making sure she felt every inch of the distance between us. Now you're left with exactly what you deserve. The look in her eyes shifted, the familiar rage sparking as she realized she was well and truly alone. She had no one to run to, no allies left. Her golden reputation was as shattered as our life together. As I turned to walk away, she called out one last, frantic plea. David, you can't just leave me like this. What am I supposed to do now? I didn't even look back as I answered. Figure it out, Leela. You always were resourceful. And with that, I left her standing there, watching me disappear, free at last. A couple of days later, I was packing up to leave town and start fresh somewhere else. The last of my belongings were loaded into the moving truck when I remembered the final touch I'd left for her. A Boy Scout emblem, an ironic reminder of the loyalty she'd squandered. I sent a message to her new address, a simple line, "Do you feel safe now?" As I started my engine and pulled away, I could almost see her receiving it. That small token she'd find in the box of things I'd sent over, realizing that, for the first time in her life, she couldn't manipulate her way back. For once, she had no control. And neither did I. But this time, it felt like freedom. As I drove down the highway, I watched my old life fade in the rearview mirror. It felt surreal. For years, I'd played the role of the dutiful husband, always keeping the peace, always putting Leela's needs first. I'd sacrificed so much, all for the illusion of stability. But that illusion was gone now, shattered the moment I'd discovered her betrayal. The next town was a couple of hours away, and as the miles ticked by, I let myself savor the strange sense of relief washing over me. Freedom felt lighter than I'd imagined. No more wondering, no more pretending. Just me, the open road, and the promise of a fresh start. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a sense that, for the first time in a long time, I could choose where my life was headed. Then, about an hour into the drive, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, half expecting to see another frantic message from Leela, but it wasn't her. It was Frank. David, he said, his voice steady. Got something you might want to know about. You got a minute? What's going on, Frank? I asked, a little wary. I thought I'd left everything behind. Well, you know Leela isn't the type to accept defeat, he said, sounding almost amused. Turns out, she's trying to stir up trouble with some of the legal contacts in town. Apparently, she's been spinning quite the story. Claims you pulled some kind of financial scam on her. Says you tricked her into signing documents. Took her for everything she had. I laughed. That's rich, coming from her. Let her spin her story. I have more than enough proof of her affair to shut down any last-ditch sob story she's peddling. True, Frank replied, sounding almost proud. But she's getting desperate. David, this isn't over for her. You've made her life hell, and if I know anything about Leela, she'll make it her mission to get even. Let her try, I said, shrugging. She's the one who gambled and lost. She can try all the legal wrangling she wants, but I'm done letting her control the narrative. Frank chuckled. That's the spirit. But listen, I'm keeping an eye on things. If she pulls any stunts that cross the line, you'll be the first to know. Thanks, Frank. I appreciate it. I hung up, feeling that familiar spark of determination. Leela was going to play her last card. Of course she was. But I'd already anticipated her every move. There was nothing left she could throw at me that I hadn't already planned for. A few hours later, I pulled into a small coastal town. Waves crashing against the shore as the sun dipped low in the sky. The place had a quiet charm, unassuming, peaceful, the kind of town where nobody knew my name or my history. It was exactly what I needed. I rented a small place on the edge of town and started unpacking, savoring the quiet, the freedom from Layla's drama. The days passed slowly at first, filled with small, simple routines I'd forgotten I could enjoy. Early morning coffee on the porch, walks by the beach, conversations with friendly strangers who didn't expect anything from me. It felt like the first chapter of a new life. And yet, every now and then, I'd catch myself checking my phone, half expecting to see another desperate message from Leela. It was like a habit, a phantom which I couldn't quite shake. But as weeks turned into months, the memories of her faded, and so did the bitterness. She was a ghost of my past now, haunting someone else's life while I moved on. One day, a package arrived at my door. I hadn't ordered anything, so I opened it with curiosity, wondering who'd send it. Inside was a small box, wrapped in worn, crumpled paper. I pulled it open and found a single envelope with my name on it, written in familiar handwriting. I almost laughed out loud. Of course it was from Leela. I sat down and opened the letter, expecting more theatrics. But instead, it was short, simple, and completely out of character. David, it read, you took everything from me. I don't know how to forgive you, but I guess that's what you wanted. I just wanted you to know that I'll never stop regretting what I did. You played the game better, and I lost. No apologies, no promises to change, just a cold admission of defeat. She hadn't found forgiveness or redemption, just bitterness. I folded the letter back up, feeling nothing but a strange sense of closure. I left the letter on the beach that night, letting the tide sweep it away. Leela was the past, a lesson learned, and as I watched the waves carry the paper out to sea, I realized that I was free for good this time. Whatever she tried next, wherever her schemes took her, it was no longer my concern. The future was mine, and for the first time, it felt wide open. Months passed, and each day, that feeling of liberation grew stronger. It was incredible how life simplified without Leela's endless scheming hovering over me. I'd found a job managing logistics for a local marina, a world away from the relentless demands of corporate law, and I liked it. People here didn't care about my past. They knew me as the quiet guy who could fix a dock line or recommend the best spot to cast a line for early morning fishing. But then, one evening, as the sky was fading into shades of purple and gold, Frank called. He'd been keeping tabs, as promised, and I hadn't heard from him in weeks, which was a good sign. Still, the second I heard his voice, my stomach tightened. David, he said, sounding amused, looks like you're finally off the hook for good. I raised an eyebrow, meaning, Leela's got herself into a bit of trouble. He cleared his throat. Remember Thomas? How could I forget? The very mention of the man's name had haunted me for months, though less and less as I built my new life. What's he done now? Frank chuckled, clearly relishing the news. Well, it's what they've both done, really. The two of them have been playing house, right? But our dear Leela, always the savvy operator, started siphoning money from her new lover's accounts. Thomas didn't take it well, and he's filing charges. I almost dropped the phone. Leela tried to con him, too? Old habits die hard, I guess. She probably figured he'd be too smitten to notice. Or maybe she thought he owed her for losing her marriage. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. But at the same time, it was fitting. The very woman who'd once treated me like a bank account on legs, now burning her last bridges with the one man she thought she could trust. Her attempts to claw her way back to wealth and power had only led her further down the drain. That's not all, Frank added, the grin evident in his voice. Thomas's lawyers aren't messing around. They're pressing full charges, including fraud and theft. She's going to be tied up in court for a long, long time. I laughed, long and hard, as the irony washed over me. Leila, who had always prided herself on her clever schemes, now trapped by her own deceit. I'd given her the freedom to start over, and she'd only dug herself deeper. So, I said finally, the world got its justice after all. Yes, it did. And don't worry, David, I'll keep an eye on things. But something tells me she'll be too busy dealing with Thomas and the courts to bother you again. When we hung up, I felt an unexpected wave of gratitude. For Frank, for my new life, for everything that had brought me to this quiet coastal town. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The next morning, I drove down to the marina early, watching the boats bob and the gentle morning waves, thinking of all that had led me here. I thought about the games I'd played, the deception I'd used to outweed her. But there was no bitterness anymore, no lingering resentment, just the knowledge that, in the end, I'd won in ways she'd never understand. As I watched the sun rise over the ocean, I realized something. Life was no longer about winning or losing. It was about the peace I found after all the chaos. Leila's final, spectacular downfall wasn't mine to worry about, or even save her. I had left that world behind. With a deep breath, I turned back to the marina and the promise of a new day, fully ready to live the life I'd fought so hard to reclaim.